Well, welcome everybody. My name is Jeremy Brown, and I'm a professor in the history department at Simon Fraser University. My specialty is in modern Chinese history, and I am very pleased to welcome all of you to this, the final event in the history department's annual lecture series, the theme of which is Witnesses to History. And I want to start tonight by respectfully acknowledging that the place where I'm standing right now is the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And saying this kind of territorial acknowledgement is a small thing. It's become a ritual in Canadian academia, but I'd argue that it's good and it's necessary. It's a good and necessary ritual because it's a chance for me to say personally that I care about history. I care about reconciliation and justice in today's North American settler colonial system, in which I'm an uninvited guest on this land where I work and where I live, right here on the campus of Simon Fraser University in Burnaby. So I joined my work community, I joined my university, I joined the history department in committing to this long-term listening and learning. And I encourage you to take this opportunity to think about what you would say if you were acknowledging Indigenous territory in the place where you're sitting right now. And our main focus for tonight, Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, he said it and wrote a lot about reconciliation and justice in the aftermath of trauma, violence, and injustice in China. So tonight's event itself is part of a broader project of learning about and working on how recent history connects to activism against violence and oppression. So I'm going to tell you the plan for tonight. This event will indeed be and is being recorded, and in a couple of weeks at the latest you'll get an email with a link to the recording. And because of the large audience and because of time constraints, we're going to use a webinar format in which the chat function for audience members is not functioning, and then the one way for you to interact with our special guest and to ask questions is by using the Q&A function on Zoom. So you'll type your questions there. And we'll start the question and answer part of the event about halfway through, but you can type in your questions anytime. I encourage you to type them at any time. You can type them in English, you can type them in Chinese. 你要提什么问题可以随时写中文写英文都行. And when we get to the Q&A part of the event, you will see my colleague, Professor Lauren Faulkner-Rossi on screen. And Professor Faulkner-Rossi is a limited term assistant professor in history at Simon Fraser. She is a superstar researcher and a superstar teacher who knows a ton about the history of trauma and violence in recent history. Her book, Wehrmacht Priests, Catholicism and the Nazi War of Annihilation, came out with Harvard University Press in 2015. And so she's going to be sorting through your questions and posing your questions to our special guest. And I'm really grateful to Professor Faulkner-Rossi for joining us as the question wrangler tonight. And I should also apologize in advance. If we don't get to all your questions, we probably won't, in which case feel free to get in touch with us over email so we can continue this dialogue. And we'll do our best to get to all the questions. If we can't, we might not get to everything. You might also notice that my colleague Jonathan Goodlickson will be answering your technical questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And Jonathan is the SFU History Department's communications coordinator. He's a hugely talented organizer and communicator, among other things, and he deserves immense credit for making things happen in our department, and especially for making tonight's event happen. So thank you so much, Jonathan. All right, let's talk about Perry Link. Perry Link is our featured guest tonight, and he is Professor Emeritus of East Asian Studies at Princeton University and is the Chancellorial Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines at the University of California, Riverside. Professor Link has written many influential books and articles, but on top of that incredible scholarly productivity, I also want to note that he has taught and continues to teach Chinese language at all levels to thousands of students, and he teaches clear, precise English language writing to thousands and thousands of students, and I admire him for that. I see Professor Link as my teacher in these areas, and also in the area of being an inveterate revealer, a persistent uncoverer of events and people and voices and ideas that power holders in China try to hide, conceal, and cover up. And I admire that. And Perry Link is my teacher in that regard. And so we're here tonight to talk about and get a really special sneak preview of Professor Link's new forthcoming biography of Liu Xiaobo, which Link is co-authoring with a co-author, Wu Dazhi. So without further ado, let's welcome Perry Link, and let me start asking you some questions about your project. So my first question for you is, why did you and your co-author decide to write a biography of Liu Xiaobo?
There's a big answer and a little answer to that. By little, I mean what actually happened day to day. When Liu Xiaobo was ill in the summer of 2017 and looked as if he was near the end, I wrote a memoir about him. And the day he died, I published it in the New York Review of Books. And a couple of days after that, an editor at Basic Books in New York gave me an email saying, "We like that article. Can you make it into a full book?" And I wrote back, "No, I can't, because I don't really know enough about him. But somebody who I know does know enough, and that's my colleague Cui Weiping, who is visiting here in California as well. She was a colleague of his and went through a lot of the movements and the plans and the writings of things with him. She knows all about him." So we asked her, and she said, "No, because I don't know English and I don't feel confident writing a book in English to a foreign audience." So then the obvious thing to try was to have us cooperate, and that's what we did. What I mean by the big answer to the question is, though, that I had the feeling, and she had the feeling, and we still do have the feeling, that this thinker, Liu Xiaobo, is bigger than the world generally gives him credit for. He came up with a nonviolent philosophy for bringing about social and political change that, in my view, ranks with Martin Luther King and Mohandas Gandhi. It's original. He read and admired King and Gandhi and others, but his theory, maybe we can get to it later in our talk, is grounded in hard experience in China. And that really deserves notice. I think one reason he doesn't get noticed as much as people like Mandela and Havel and King and the others is that he didn't succeed. We're thinking of calling our book Long March Toward Freedom. We haven't decided yet, but that's our current thought, which you might recognize as an echo of Nelson Mandela's book. What is his Slow Walk to Freedom? We took out to and put in toward because Liu Xiaobo didn't get there, as Mandela clearly did, and as Václav Havel clearly did. But I could go on forever in this vein, but the answer to that second part of the question is that we both think that he should be viewed as a world-level thinker.
What can you tell us about your co-author and how your collaboration has proceeded in terms of co-authoring a book?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, her name is Cui Weiping. The Wu Dazhi is a pseudonym that she's using in order to protect her family back in China by not making the Communist Party too angry in a direct way. But she, as I mentioned a moment ago, knew him well. She went to college in Chinese literature as he did. She went to grad school in Chinese literature as he did. They started working together in the early 2000s on what they call the citizens movement and on Charter 08. And then she was a close follower of his fate after he was arrested and sentenced to 11 years in prison and given the Nobel Prize. So she really knows a lot, but it's true that she doesn't know English. And our way of cooperating was that she'd send me a pile of stuff, chapter by chapter, basically, but sometimes not even that. And then my job would be to edit the stuff into a chapter and then, of course, write it out in English and send it back to her. And she would say, no, we have to expand here or cut that part out. And so we would go back and forth, but she was the content provider and I was the carpenter, if I can put it that way.
So I asked you, should we invite Tsai Wei-ping to this event? And it's just a practical language question that you answered back with that no, it probably wouldn't work because the interpretation from Chinese would make it too unwieldy. But I actually suspected that you said that also because you didn't want her identity to get out, but you're comfortable saying her name. You're not using the pseudonym here on this Zoom meeting on which, we have a webinar now. We got 79 people here. It's going to be recorded. Is that okay? So what can, I guess I ask you that not just for a yes or no answer, but to reflect on the process of pseudonyms and the possible political implications, because it seems like at this level, it's comfortable to mention the name, but on the cover of the book, it's not. Is that right?
Right.
Why is that?
Right from the beginning, we haven't kept it secret. I'm sure the Ministry of State Security in Beijing knows that she's writing this book and with me, and that that's a very naughty thing to do. That's known, and there's no way to keep that a secret. When she did say that she didn't want to use her real name on the cover and in advertising, I asked her the question you just asked me. Why? If they already know, why use a pseudonym? And I'm paraphrasing now, but if she, as it were, genuflects to the party's power and lets them keep face by not confronting them directly, that makes her less offensive than if she puts her name right there under their noses. Here I am saying this. Yeah. It's a very subtle thing, but it's important. Yeah. She still has a father and a daughter and a granddaughter in China who can suffer if she makes the party too angry.
So in a way, actually, by not participating in person in this event, we're doing the same thing. We're talking about her, but she is not putting up the middle finger directly to the censors and the Communist Party. So in a way, it is a political consideration there. But let's talk about the book. Let's talk about, and especially, I think we should talk about Liu Xiaobo for our audience members who might not know about him. What do you think are the most important things about Liu Xiaobo that audience members need to know who really haven't heard much about him?
I would divide his important characteristics into two categories. One are his inborn character traits that lasted him all through his life. And the others are aspects of his behavior that he learned through tough experience. Let me go to the first list first. He stutters. He stuttered his whole life. That's inborn. He was very smart. He complained to his first-year teacher in primary school that her explanations were too simple. And that's another characteristic that he had from the beginning, a kind of a puckish, rebellious streak, a natural disrespect for authority that wasn't earned. You have to earn your authority with him. And that lasted through his whole life. He had a photographic memory. And he learned this when he started reading in high school and learned that he could impress his girlfriend by reciting whole pages of Marx, which is what he was reading then, word for word the next day. And a good analytic ability. His essays on all kinds of topics are insightful and incisive, I should say. He was a voracious reader once he got into it. And he read Chinese history from ancient times to modern times and Western culture and writes on an amazing variety of things well. So he's tremendously talented that way. Self-confident, a little bit too, especially in the first part of his life. But he had another endearing trait, and that's that he, throughout his life, was self-critical. He would do things and then criticize himself for having done them. And one reason it was not that hard to write his biography is that he wrote a lot of essays about what he used to do and why it was wrong. So all of that was inborn. The learned characteristics, which are his most admirable ones and which I think qualify him to be called a world-level thought leader, were his pacifist advocacy of social change and political change. And again, we can get more into this. It's really the heart of his big contribution to the world. But when he did that, his character was different. He went to a labor camp from 1996 to 99. And he read history and religion, and he wrote poetry, a lot of poetry in those 3 years. And his friends who knew him well said he came out of the labor camp a different person from what went in. He had a sharp kind of chip on shoulder arrogance before, and he came out with a strong sense of empathy, very prone to empathizing with underdogs especially, and very gentle in person. And this is reflected in his philosophy, where his goal is to change the regime. And one of his essays has that phrase in its title. But it's done gently, where you make an advance, and if necessary, you back up and then wait for the party authorities to have their way for a while, and then you move back into the unoccupied territory, and you keep a sort of a gentle approach to change. And that's very different from the way he felt in the 80s.
Well, let's dig a little deeper into some of his main activist principles that you were arguing put him on the level of a world level political activist thinker. The one that comes to mind is this idea that to change a regime, we must change society. What does that mean? Why is that important?
That's a good capsule for his whole approach, which I've called in a separate essay that I wrote his 8-point program. That's my phrase, not his, the 8 points, but I'll share with you what those 8 points are. One is to look at ordinary people with daily life problems and start there. And that's already different from the democracy movement in the 80s, who constantly wanted to have dialogue with the top. You know, even Wei Jingsheng in the late 70s came out with his 5th modernization, which is obviously an echo of Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations. So even from the beginning, and with someone as dissident as Wei Jingsheng, you see an urge to have dialogue with the top and bring about change from the top down. After the '89 massacre, he and a lot of others decided that doesn't work. It didn't work then, and it won't work again. So you start at the bottom with actual people and actual problems. When you grasp their problems, you publicize the case. That's step 2. The early 2000s, fortuitously, is when the internet was coming into China. And the party had not yet figured out how to dominate the internet. So the internet was a key tool in doing the publication. You find a case of bullying or mistreatment, and you put it on the internet, and instantly you have a lot of support, because ordinary people reading it are reflexively going to sympathize with the ones that are being oppressed, not the oppressors. So when it gets out in public that way, 2 consequences happen. These are my steps 3 and 4. One is that it puts pressure on local officials who used to be able to act with impunity. If it's known, then people gather and there's demonstrations and you did wrong, and that local official also gets pressure from his superiors, because the superiors' command to the inferiors in the bureaucracy is always keep the lid on, make sure there's no trouble, quote unquote, in your area. So this trapped these local officials, and they got to know that they could be trapped, and therefore had to be much more careful in how they picked on people. The other consequence was that it forced the state press to change. Because if there was some kind of, let's say, rape or murder or something, and it gets out on the internet, and the state media doesn't cover it, then everybody believes the social media, and there's no pushback. The state media used to be able to ignore things like that, or if publish them in a very distorted form. But when the internet comes out, they can't do that, because if they stray too far from the true story, nobody will believe them. And that brought about change in how the state media, how well the state media, how truthfully the state media reported things. Added to the fact that there are a lot of, there were then and probably still are, reporters in the local state media who do want to be good journalists and want to do that anyway. So then you push out these stories and you get your support. And the step 5 that I analyze is you watch for principles to emerge. Where do these outcries of injustice have something in common? And this went case by case. One of the first cases that they ran across was a case where a young married couple in Yan'an, the revolutionary base, got married, and they went home and they watched pornographic videotapes. And a neighbor found that out and reported it to the police. And the police came to their door and demanded that the tapes be turned over. And when the husband argued back, they grabbed him and brought him down to the police station and beat him up and held it for 15 days. And this got out on the internet. And of course, the overwhelming majority of people sympathize with the married couple and not with the police. And that starts to get people to think about principles. Liu Xiaobo points out that in that case, no one ever thought before about the borderline between state power and my private rights. It didn't come up. But when it comes up in this dramatic kind of form, does the state have the right to look inside my bedroom? No. And then the consciousness of individual rights versus states' rights comes up. Okay, my step 6 that he followed is to advocate rule changes. One of his examples of this I'll give you the most famous example. You may know about the Sunzhigang case, where a young man from Wuhan went down to Guangzhou to work in an art design factory. And 2 days after he was there, he was bicycling along the street and accosted by police, and he didn't have a local residence permit because he hadn't gotten one yet. He's just arrived. They brought him to the police station and beat him up. And 3 days later, he was dead in the police station. And the official report was he'd had some kind of heart attack or some other disease, but it was obviously false. And a local reporter in one of the semi-autonomous local newspapers found out the truth and got it out there, and it spread all over the country. And then a group of lawyers in Beijing championed it, and then some law professors championed it. And it went so far that even the central government could not deny that what happened happened. And that young man had been arrested under what was called a repatriation law, a 收容遣送, taking you, arresting you and repatriating you. And that was for people who were coming in from the countryside looking for work in the cities and didn't have residence permits and were flooding the cities in the view of the local governments. So they were scooped up and sent back under this law. And that was the law under which this Sunzhigang had been scooped up. Well, the demands all the way to the top were that law is unconstitutional. And it went through appeals and pushings and pullings, but it worked. And in the end, that law was canceled. Now, other laws were sort of substituted, but that's his goal, is to get the popular opinion strong enough and concrete enough that a rule or a law is changed. So you see, it's the opposite of the 1980s approach, where the dissidents went right to the top and said, change the rules, change the laws, and they got smashed down eventually. Here you go from the bottom up and you have popular support. So it's very hard for the leaders to crush it, and you can make progress. The last two steps in my analysis of his approach are be gradual and nonviolent is number 7, and be leaderless is the last one. Gradual and nonviolent, I sort of described just a moment ago. You push until you get severe pushback, but then you don't. You retreat, and then you wait for it to calm down, and then you go in again. This, ironically, rhymes with Mao Zedong's guerrilla warfare principle. You know, 敌一进我退，敌一退我追. But that was their principle too. And you do that because if you do get at loggerheads with them and make them lose face, you're going to get crushed and you're going to be set back farther than you would have been if you just gracefully backed out for a while and then returned. And leaderless was all through the citizens movement that used these principles didn't have a formal structure, and they didn't have a commander-in-chief or anything like that, deliberately not doing it, knowing that once you did that, the leader would be picked off. You know, in Chinese idioms, we say, 枪打出头鸟, the head of the bird that sticks its neck out gets blown off. That's, in a crude way, the reason for the leaderlessness. And that leaderlessness principle spread, and I could give you several examples about others who'd used it. I'll give very quickly one. There was a big garbage incinerator put up in the city of Panyu outside of Guangzhou, and people got out there and picketed it and had signs and marches and sit-ins, but some of the signs says, "We have no leaders." The Hong Kong resistance, too, before it was crushed, used that leaderlessness principle. So those are what I sketch out as his contribution. And you see what I mean. It grew out of the hardscrabble experience of China. It wasn't copied from Martin Luther King or Mohandas Gandhi, but it ranks with them, I think, and it's important.
You've said several times that his main contributions, this philosophy, this strategy, these ideas, these principles were quite different, almost the opposite of the approach of activism in the 1980s, especially 1989. And so I want to focus on that a little bit because in your project, June 4th, the Beijing massacre, the protest that led up to it, the crackdown and arrest of people afterward, including the arrest of Liu Xiaobo, it comes up again and again in your manuscript as one of his driving obsessions. Even decades after, he is obsessed with what happened in China in 1989. And when he learned that he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, "This prize is for all the lost souls of June 4th. They are the ones who gave their lives for the spirit of peace, freedom, democracy, and nonviolence." So can you tell us about, what happened to him in 1989? Why do you think this was such an important turning point for him? And I mean, for me, a lot of people got to know this image of Liu Xiaobo because he was in the center of the stage right at the very end in early June 1989 as one of the last hunger strikers, a prominent hunger striker who was very involved at the end. And then after that, I didn't think about him very much, and he just seemed easy to dismiss as somebody who is chasing attention from the press and putting himself in the center of this movement that, he kind of came a bit late to and didn't play that prominent of a role in. And so I admit myself, I kind of wrote him off that way, and I just found him, I'm embarrassed to admit this now, just sort of annoying and not that worthy of all the attention that he was getting. And that changed. I changed my mind after I read No Enemies, No Hatred, the collection of essays that you edited along with others, when I saw the power of his ideas afterwards. But a lot of people, I think, are still stuck in that previous dismissive view. So that's sort of where I'm coming at with this question about 1989.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with your view, if it is yours and those others, that his performance at Tiananmen is not his biggest contribution to the movement and to Chinese democracy. What I just described as his step-by-step pushing for changing a regime by changing society is. In other words, from 2002 to 2008, those years in the citizens movement, intellectually, were a much bigger contribution than what he did at Tiananmen. He came to Tiananmen from New York. He flew back because he wanted to be there. He wanted to be part of it. And a year earlier, he was already an academic superstar. And this is where some of his not so pretty behavior was visible. He had arrogance and he was sexually promiscuous, not very good to his wife and all of these things, but he was a superstar. Then he comes back from New York and expects to be welcomed as the returning superstar, and he wasn't. He'd already been away long enough that people had turned elsewhere, and figures like Wu Kaixi were the big new superstars. And he was a little bit jealous of that, I think, and wanted to make himself more important. But he brought in this compromising philosophy. He learned when he was abroad in New York and other places that democracy isn't just a system of electing or a system of laws from the top down. It's a culture. And people in a democratic society naturally get in line and stuff like that. And that's the philosophy he wanted to bring to Tiananmen. So you people should cooperate with the regime, see if you can find common ground. And that didn't go over very well. He finally did that hunger strike, sort of in imitation of the students' summer hunger strike. They'd done a big one already, and he and his friends, Gao Xin and the other two, what are the Zhou Duo and the Taiwan crooner. So they had their own 4-person hunger strike, and that got a lot of press and stuff. Then what he did that was really the most admirable at Tiananmen was to negotiate with the approaching army in order to allow quite a few thousand probably students exit the square through the southeast corner and perhaps save their lives. But let me go back to the why you asked at the beginning, what made such a deep impression on him? And I don't think it was intellectual. It wasn't a big breakthrough. It was emotional. I think he was just hit very hard emotionally. I think it's when he first confronted the idea of death and dying and killing. Before, he'd said that he admires the famous Chinese writer Liu Xun in all kinds of ways. And Liu Xun is a great social and political critic and this and that. But Liu Xun could not stare at death. He could not face the grave. Liu Xiaobo, and I should have mentioned this as one of his enduring, sort of inborn characteristics, he did have that sort of respect for the transcendent in him. He never became the believer of a religion. He had friends who urged him to become Christian, and he didn't want to. But he read Christian theology, and he read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the anti-Nazi activist who died for his principles, and he admired this kind of stuff. And when he saw people die, that hit him deeply, especially since they were underdogs, because another of his natural principles throughout his life was to sympathize with underdogs. So here you have these underdogs being killed, and it just hit him in the solar plexus and made him want, at every anniversary of the massacre since then, to write a poem. I brought a poem here to read, and this is not by him. This is by his second wife, Liu Xia, who lived through those post-Tiananmen years with him. She wrote this poem that hit him very hard. It's very short. I'll read it. It's called Black Night. Those eyes will come back tonight. Those ghosts will come back tonight. In the posture of gravestones, all of the ghosts, all of the eyes, assembling next to this little candle flame, using silence to converse with me. He wrote, in response to that poem, a very long poem back to her about these ghosts. But ever since then, he had this sense in his mind of the lost souls, he called them, the Wang Hun, that are hovering above and watching what he does. And I can't prove it, but that's the mood in which I think he made that comment that you quoted to Liu Xiaobo about this Nobel Prize is for, for the lost ghosts. So it hit him very hard emotionally.
Well, let me ask you, if you don't mind, how did it hit you? I mean, you were there in Beijing in 1989, so you were a witness. Liu was a witness. So would you mind telling us what your most lasting memories of what you witnessed in 1989? How did that experience change your life? Did it change your career trajectory? Did it change the way you think about China?
It changed it, yeah, but not drastically. All through the 80s, in studying Chinese writers who were now called dissidents, Liu Binyan among them, I more and more was getting disillusioned with what my original socialist ideals had been. In graduate school, I was a socialist. I was an anti-Vietnam protesting leader, and I edited the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars. And when I got to China, I learned both through living in the society and reading these scar literature pieces that that picture of an ideal society just wasn't true at all. So I was pretty disillusioned all through the 80s. And when I lived through the massacre, it was, I guess it was sort of a last straw experience that, okay, that does it. If that can happen, I'm out of here in terms of, intellectual investment in Chinese socialism. I didn't see any actual violence. I was staying away from the square because at the time I was the National Academy of Sciences representative in Beijing. And my friend Fang Lizhi, who was a famous astrophysicist and known as a dissident, he would not go to the square. And he advised me, you shouldn't go to the square because if you do, they will photograph you and say, aha, there's proof that all of this was stirred up by American agents. Perry Link works for the US government. And of course, that means the CIA, and all of that's not true, of course, but it could be pinned on the movement. So don't go there. And I didn't. On the morning of the massacre, I did get up and go around on my bicycle to visit a number of Chinese friends, including Fang Lizhi and his wife, but including a number of others, just to see how they were doing and to hear their analyses of the scene. And I did see people bicycling back from downtown with bloody rags on the backs of their bicycles. And I guess the most moving thing I saw was a broadcast stand that the students at Renmin Daxue, the People's University, had set up, which was right next to where I was living at the Youyi Binguan. And they had this broadcasting station, and they allowed people who were coming back from different parts of the city to get up and say what they had seen. And some of them were just screaming bloody murder, just out of control with their anger and their pain. Some of them were icy cold, gritting their teeth and just, but still, trying to express the inexpressible. That hit me hard. One thing that hit me hard at that scene was that others in the crowd, here I was a foreigner, and there weren't many foreigners in the crowd, but there were students, there were others from the street, I guess regular working people. There were farmers coming in from the countryside with their big tricycles, bringing their vegetables in. And when they saw the Guangbo-chan, the broadcasting stand, they stopped and listened too. And what impressed me was that it didn't matter that I was a foreigner. I would look at those farmers or those workers or whoever the others were, and you just look at each other and you just, as if you're saying, holy shit to each other, and you're on the same wavelength with nothing else having to be considered. You're a foreigner, I'm not. You're a peasant, I'm not. One thing that bothers me about remembering my own personal recollections, though, is that I left Beijing 5 days after the massacre, after I cleaned up all my duties that the National Academy of Sciences wanted me to clean up, and flew to Hong Kong. And when I got to Hong Kong, a whole bunch in the press were there to ask me all kinds of questions over and over and over again, because it had already been reported that I'd helped Fang Lizhi go to the embassy, and so I was sort of a minor figure, but a minor star, you'd say, and they all wanted to interview me. And they'd all ask the same questions. What did you see? What was it like? And so I'd say, and I'd give them a talk. And it got repeated so often. And even when I flew back to California, that same set of questions got repeated so much that I started to distrust my own answers. Because you start to tell a story, and then you tell it a second time and a third time, you start to tell not what that original confusing jumble of horrible impressions was. You start to repeat the story that you've already told to other people because it's easier, and also because I think you rosify it. By that I mean, anytime you tell a person a story about something like this, you notice what they like and what they don't like. Even if you're not trying to, you do, and it gets into your brain that, oh, this part of the story is a good part, I better say it. So that by the time 2 months had passed, I started to just wonder, how much of these stories reflect what I really remember and how much are woven?
Well, let's talk about rosifying then. How do you avoid rosifying the memory of Liu Xiaobo? This is a person who clearly you admire his philosophy. You think he's important enough to deserve a major biography. You've mentioned a few of his shortcomings and mistakes, but how do you handle that as an author of a biography when you're trying to give a comprehensive picture of somebody who you admire, but also did some bad things and made some mistakes?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And Cui Weiping and I had a number of conversations about this. She'd bring up something that doesn't reflect well on him and want to know if we should put it in the book or not. And my principle, and I think hers in the end too, was that if it's true, we should put it in the book. And if it doesn't look good, well, nobody's perfect. I mean, Martin Luther King had outside affairs too. It almost humanizes a person to show the warts is too small a word. Some of them were pretty bad flaws with him. I mentioned arrogance. In the late 80s, when he was on the speaking circuit, because he was so eloquent about Chinese and Western literature, and he drew these huge crowds at local universities, and even once he'd go to Tianjin and Shijiazhuang and other nearby places, and people would hang from the rafters to hear him and stuff. He got arrogant about that, and Cui Weiping, came up with some true stories about his arrogance. For example, at one place, he was in the money, because this is the way he could make money. And you don't get paid very much as a lecturer at Beijing Normal University, so he didn't feel guilty about making a little bit more money. But he would demand a lot of money. And in one case, he even stopped his lecture in the middle and said, okay, if you want the second half, you have to double my yanjiang fei. You have to pay me double, which is pretty nasty. Once, after the lecture, 2 students came up to give him his envelope with his honorarium in it, and he opened it right in front of them, and he scoffed at how small it was. So he took the bills and gave it back to them and said, here, go across the street and get some refreshments, which is just gratuitously nasty. And I mentioned his sexual deviations. During his stardom, women were attracted to him, and he had hordes pursuing him. I'm sure that's true. You can't say that he was out looking for them. But then he did. He had a steady stream of different girlfriends. And some of his friends said he'd bring them into a party, and they wouldn't know anybody else. And it was the first time any of them had seen this young woman. And he wouldn't even introduce the new girlfriend, bring them in, and then the next day have another new girlfriend. And even that, I mean, you can say that's maybe a prudish criticism of him. But what I think is more serious is that this cost his wife very dearly. Tao Li, his first wife, she was deeply hurt by it. He didn't come home. He was flamboyantly unfaithful to her. When he was in prison for the first time after the Tiananmen events, she came to him with her parents, and they brought him divorce papers. and he signed them. This shows this part of his character too. He does these terrible things, but then blames himself for it. And he almost took her side in arguing, yes, you should divorce me. And they did divorce. But it scarred her fairly deeply. She was a scholar of Japanese literature that she'd inherited sort of from her father, who was a famous professor of Japanese literature. And right after the Tiananmen events, she wrote a book about why is my mind blanking? The famous Japanese prince. Why is it?
I don't remember it myself.
Anyway, this Japanese prince who has too many girlfriends and is unfaithful time and time again, and then turns around and blames himself for it and confesses. And she writes this sort of elegant story of the Japanese prince without saying that this is what I see in Liu Xiaobo, but it clearly was. It clearly was. When we started, Cui Weiping and I started our project, we wanted to see if we could reach Tao Li to interview her, because she, we're told, lives in California. We couldn't find her, but we found her younger sister, and I wrote a very careful letter to the younger sister asking her to please pass this to Tao Li. And I tried to make it as clear as possible that I was a open-minded scholar trying to be objective. And I went as far as I could to say, I'm ready to sympathize with you. Can you please come and talk to us? And we never got an answer one way or another. And other people who know her just say that she cut off. She just didn't want anything to do with it at all. That just shows how deeply she was hurt. So this has to be chalked up to the not so great side of our hero, Liu Xiaobo.
Let me ask you one more question before we get to the Q&A. So this is a cue for those of you who are holding on to your questions. You can go ahead and start typing those in the Q&A. But you just mentioned something about yourself as a open-minded scholar, objective scholar, I think you even said. At the same time, you've been personally involved in the events that we're describing. I mean, you assisted Fang Lizhi, this dissident, to get to the U.S. Embassy and escape China. Personally, you did that. You were in touch with Liu Xiaobo directly when he was drafting Charter 08. Your English translation was published right when that document was released. So you are part of that process, right? You gave it international prominence.
Right.
So you're a part of this history actively. I mean, and I see this as scholarly activism or activist scholarship. Do you consider yourself a scholar activist? How would you respond if people criticize you that you're too involved in advocacy as a scholar?
Yeah. What I meant by objective just now was sort of empirical objectivism. That is, I try not to approach things with a bias. But when I see something that I feel is outrageous, I don't back off from saying that it's outrageous. So the term scholar activist doesn't quite fit what I like to think of myself as, because I don't see it as a duality in a sense. I see it as the same thing. Let me try to be more specific by putting that in the context of the study of modern Chinese literature, which is my main field, and then the life in the American Academy, which of course we all are, or Canadian Academy. In the field of modern Chinese literature, most of the good writers were activists in that sense. They wanted China to be a better place. They took sides in social issues. They took sides in political issues. They wrote about unfairnesses, and all from Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Lao She, Bajin, all the way through. So to say that getting into that kind of culture is a activist mode doesn't feel that way to me. It just feels like I jumped into the mainstream and I'm swimming with the mainstream. And to put a sharper point on that, a lot of people in the literature field, not only for China, but a lot of literatures, go for this sort of fashionable postmodernist jargon kind of approach and talk about the imbrication of the discourse of subjectivity within a carnivalesque panopticon or whatever. You know what I mean. That is I'm afraid in the Western Academy, that is a kind of a mainstream, and I consciously object to that. One of the reasons I object to it, well, one is that it's not clear and it's pompous, but another is that it's outside of the field of modern Chinese literature. If you look at the writers and the readers in the 20th century in China, none of them go that route. So to join in the political social concerns of Chinese literature is to be in the mainstream, not to be out of it. In the American Academy, I've come to feel that I owe something to the tenure system. It's fun to be a professor. It's a great life. You get a good salary, not a stupendous one, but an upper middle class salary. When you get tenure, you get it guaranteed all the way to the grave. You get social respect. And what's your job? Your job is to tell the truth as you see it. That's your job. Now, a lawyer's job is to press for that client's side, to see it from that side. You know, a basketball player's job is to get this ball through that hoop. A scholar's job is to tell the truth. And society makes a deal with us about that. We're going to give you tenure so that you can tell the truth. The original purpose of the tenure system was not that professors are nice people and they should have guaranteed groceries. Sometimes it's viewed that way, but the original purpose was to let the scholar be free of pressure so that the scholar could tell the truth as she or he sees it. Well, if I come along now and say, okay, I'll take this great deal from you, society, but I'm going to pull my punches. I'm not going to tell what I see about the wealth of the top leaders or the persecution of the Tibetans or of the Falun Gong, and I'm not going to say what I think about the repression of the Uyghurs or Hong Kong, because that will keep me from getting a visa, or if I get into China, it will keep me from getting interviews with top people. A lot of people in the field make those compromises. I'm not going to sign this, or I'm not going to say that because I want to go to China. I want to be able to have a top level interview, or if I'm an anthropologist, I want to get to have field study. And I understand all of that, of course. And I don't blame pre-tenure scholars for treading carefully. But once you have tenure, man, your deal with society is to tell the truth as you see it. And so that's what I try to do. And again, I don't quite feel that that's scholar hyphen activist. To me, that's scholar, period.
Well, thanks so much for that answer, for all your answers. This is the point at which we have our question and answer session. So let me invite my colleague, Professor Lauren Faulkner-Rossi, to moderate and pass along audience questions, and let me encourage the audience to go ahead and keep typing your questions in.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Perry and Jeremy. That was really enjoyable, and I've learned already an incredible amount, and we've got some excellent questions that I've no doubt is going to teach me even more. I'm going to apologize off the bat if I mispronounce, in particular, the Chinese names, because I don't speak Chinese, but I will do my best. The first question comes from Bill Orr, and he asks, recent international attention has been given to surveillance and persecution of ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang province. However, your presentation suggests that all citizens of the PRC are under surveillance by the state, especially people who are political activists or who have original or critical ideas that do not match those of the official state. Right. To what extent do you think that Chinese nationals living in the Western world are influenced by such state suppression? What about non-Chinese persons?
I followed that all the way until the very end. What about non-Chinese persons mean? Are non-Chinese persons in the West also subject to this intimidation that comes from surveillance?
That's how I would understand the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I'm going to say that everybody in China, in the broad sense, is subject to this kind of surveillance, which can be intimidating surveillance. It's especially severe, of course, in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs and Tajiks and others are being put into concentration camps, essentially. But it's possible to be surveilled everywhere. And the ones who do get surveilled are the ones who are potential troublemakers. One statistic that my dissident friends like to quote is that the budget for what's called the Weiwan, the maintaining stability in China, is bigger than the national defense budget. So you take all of the aircraft carriers and guns and army and putting rovers on Mars and stuff, all added together is not as much as the maintaining surveillance system. Now that system itself is a complex and big and graduated thing. If you start to cause trouble, for example, if you signed Charter 08, even though you weren't a mover or shaker in it at all, this system would come to you and the police invite you to tea, which is a euphemism for a gentle, basically civilized interrogation, where questions are put to you like, you sure you want to do this? Can't you have a better life if you take this job in this factory and lie low? Don't you worry about your children's schooling? Don't you worry about your parents' care? Where these questions are raised and you're invited to back off of that direction you're going in. If you don't listen and keep going, then you're put under residential surveillance, where you're watched in particular, not just with the regular cameras, but with police who monitor and watch, and your phone is tapped and you get listened to, and you get more threats. And if that doesn't work, then you can be detained. Detain is previous to arrest in Chinese law. You get detained and you get talked to again, and if you're still stubborn, you can be kept in a 看守所, in a detention center, which is not much more comfortable than a jail. In fact, some of them are worse than prisons. And if you still don't listen, then you can be arrested. That means you, in the states of you, have committed a crime. And from one point of view, the Chinese legal system is the fairest on earth because they don't even arrest you unless they know you're guilty. So you are interrogated after your arrest. You may be still held in a detention center or in residential surveillance. Liu Xiaobo, after he was taken away, was put into what's called a residential surveillance, but they wouldn't even tell his wife where the residence was. So it was a sort of an informal prison. And then if you still don't listen, you do go to trial and you do get a sentence and you do go to prison. And how bad a prison it is depends on how bad you were. So you see what I mean? It's a big and finely calibrated system that just gets bigger and bigger. And all that added up, which Liu Xiaobo does in our book. He has a chapter that's about this surveillance system. And at the end of it, he makes a quick calculation of how much it has cost the state to watch him for 1 month or 1 year. And it's very expensive. And you multiply that by all of the troublemakers in China, and it comes out to be more than the defense budget. Now, I say this if you're a troublemaker. If you're a person who, you know that the surveillance camera's there and stuff, but you don't cause trouble, you stay within bounds, you do self-censorship, in other words, and you play sports and you buy fashions and you go look for boyfriends, and you can do a lot and stay away from all of this. And in those cases, it isn't that you have that much intercourse with the stability system.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Perry and Jeremy, may I ask your opinion on Liu Xiaobo's tragic death? To what extent was the Chinese government involved?
I should send you our last chapter. It's not published yet, so the publisher would probably not want me to do that, but it addresses that question. He had hepatitis B early on, sometime around the Cultural Revolution he got it. Now, hepatitis B can be carried without symptoms. It doesn't have to kill you, but if it does grow, it attacks the liver. And that happened to him right about the time he was going to prison. And then during the prison years, it just got worse until it was announced suddenly in the spring of 2017, just a few months before he died, it was announced that he had stage 4 liver cancer. Hepatitis, when it attacks the liver, can easily morph into cancer, and then it can go up to stage 4. And the big question in the minds of people like me and his friends is, how much did the party know that he was getting this lethal disease, and how much did they not know? They claim to have given him thorough physicals every 2 years or so, and claim that that didn't show anything, but the claim is what it's worth. When I was in Germany a couple of years ago, I spent a year at the University of Heidelberg, and just by chance, a doctor in the Heidelberg University Hospital named Markus Buchler was the one whom Angela Merkel had arranged to go see Liu Xiaobo in the last couple of days. Angela Merkel has done some not so great things with the Chinese government recently, but she's always been very good about the dissidents. And she saw Xi Jinping at a meeting of the G7 or G8, whatever it was, and asked, can we bring Liu Xiaobo to Germany and get him examined here? And Xi Jinping said, no, he can't leave. Our doctors have already said he's not in good enough health to leave. But you are welcome to send some physicians to China to see him. And she took that up. And so this Buchler guy went, and another who was from Texas, an American, and they saw Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo amazingly had learned English during his prison. He didn't know much English at all when he went in, but it was his goal to learn English, even though he was sick and in prison. And apparently he learned English well enough that he could talk with Buchler in English. And so I asked Buchler, one of my key questions was, your question, do you think the party knew that this lethal cancer was growing? And he says it's impossible to tell, because we were given data, including the CAT scans, only for the time since it was announced that he had the disease. We were given no data or records for the time before. So even, I asked him, well, do you think it's likely that they knew? And he said, I don't want to use the word likely, but it's certainly possible. That's the best I can do on that.
Okay. Thank you. A question from Irene Pang. To the extent that one of the key points in Liu Xiaobo's 8-point program is being leaderless, how do we reconcile true leaderlessness with attributing the idea of leaderlessness to Liu Xiaobo? Certainly, leaderlessness has been observed in various other moments or events of citizen resistance and does not seem to diffuse from the elite intelligentsia. Diana Fu, for example, has a book about disguised collective action that documents the fluid, leaderless modes of resistance among Chinese workers. Does leaderlessness, in fact, still require intellectual leaders like Liu Xiaobo?
That last way of putting the question is charming. I guess my answer to that is yes. To spread the idea of leaderlessness does take a kind of unofficial leadership. And by the way, in naming this leaderlessness as step 8 of Liu Xiaobo's program, I didn't mean to imply that nobody else had ever thought of it before. I'm sure others have. It's just that he put it into his plan and gave examples of it that worked in China, and it showed that it could work. He was very influenced by Václav Havel. Cui Weiping, my co-editor, translated Havel in the early 2000s, and Liu Xiaobo and others read him. And the whole idea of starting at the ground level and working up is inspired by Havel. Havel argued that however powerful the authoritarian state is, it has prongs that go down. but there's space between the prongs. And so you, within those spaces, you be a good person. To the other people in your movement and the people in society, you be a good person as much as you can. And if you get pushed back, oh, you retreat and then you come back. So those ideas really were inspired from Havel. And why did I think of this in connection with leaderlessness? Once that idea gets abroad, you don't need a leader. People in the movement get it and act that way, and others do too. And I think we should argue that through the middle of the 2000s decade, it caught on among the people who counted themselves in this citizens movement. But in calling it a citizens movement, I don't want to give the impression that it was another layer of elite intellectuals. Certainly, Liu Xiaobo is a layer of elite intellectuals, and so is Cui Weiping and a lot of their ones that came up with these plans themselves. But their strategy was to go to the workers and the farmers and find out what was on their minds and mine the resources in them that they call common sense. You have this ideology coming down from the top and this nationalism and socialism with whatever characteristics. Ordinary people don't live their daily lives by that.
Right.
They live, wanting food, clothing, shelter, medicine, education for their kids. And what determines that level of life is common sense. So when you go down and you try to illuminate an issue and build consensus around it, your capital isn't elite thought of any kind. Your capital is the common sense that's in ordinary people's lives.
Thank you. I'm going to follow that up with a question that I had. You've spoken a couple of times about contextualizing Liu Xiaobo and the with other sort of maybe more familiar to Western audiences, activist intellectuals like Nelson Mandela and Havel you just mentioned. I think you mentioned Martin Luther King at the beginning, but you also just pointed to sort of a very stark distinction, I think, between Liu Xiaobo and these others, elites, if you will. Are there any other strong distinctions that we should make, or do you find that there's more commonality between all of them than there are strong differences?
What did you mean by stark distinction? Which one?
Well, the way you depicted his sensitivity towards or his desire to know sort of grassroots, working class, rural concerns in ways that perhaps these other elite intellectuals that you mentioned were not as consistently catering towards.
I don't know. I don't know that much about Gandhi and Mandela and Havel, but I've read some of their stuff and about them. And didn't Gandhi do his march to the sea by mobilizing a whole bunch of ordinary people? And certainly Martin Luther King, we would have to say, was plugged into ordinary Black people. I'm not sure that I see it quite as a stark difference in that sense. The starkest difference is that Liu Xiaobo died in prison, and these other people lived long enough to have their projects succeed better. That's kind of, to go back to the very first question Jeremy asked, the reason why we wanted to write this book, because certainly in thinking in these bottom-up terms and in terms of right and wrong and in willingness to go to prison for your beliefs, he's like Havel, he's like Mandela, he's like Gandhi.
Okay, thank you. Still lots of questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can. Where did it go? There was one that I wanted to ask next. Do you have plans, this is from Yidi Wu, do you have plans to publish the book in Chinese? And what do you think of the prospect of Liu Xiaobo being reevaluated and appreciated in mainland China?
Weedy, I know her. She's a grad student at UC Irvine, right? If it's the same Edie. I said, hi, Edie. No, we don't have plans to publish it in Chinese. I think it will be, though. And I think the way that's going to happen is that Cui Weiping will do her own version of the book in Chinese. I must say that, I immensely admired Cui Weiping, and we got along fine on the whole, but we had differences of opinion. She with me more than me with her. I tried to follow her every way I could, but she thought at several points that I was biased against Liu Xiaobo. And she wants to write a version that's utterly clean from his point of view. Where I was writing that made her think I was biased against him were places where I was trying to write down what the Western audience would need to know in order to get it. But so I don't, if there is a Chinese version, it won't be a translation of this book. It will be another book by her. And what was the second part of that question? Do I think Liu Xiaobo will have a comeback in future decades? Well, that depends on what happens in future decades. Yeah. Mm. I would think that when the time comes that the current system goes away, whether gently or violently or who knows what, and people can look back and do responsible history on these years, he's certain to have a comeback, yes, of some degree. Whether it will be rising to the level of a Mandela or not, I think is far-fetched. I think that chance is gone just because he died in prison. And he never had a big out in the country political movement the way Mandela did with the African National Union. Mm-hmm. He had people that sympathized with him and came to him, and he did his best to reach out to help other people. But with leaderlessness, he wasn't a political icon the way either Havel or Mandela was. But 50 years from now, might he have a comeback? I think so.
Okay, thank you. This it's a comment, but there's a question sort of wrapped into it. Comes from Double Joy. Thank you to both Professors Link and Brown. The project of shining a light on incidents that affect people's daily lives reminds me of the quote, "The personal is political," by second wave feminist movements in the 60s. It seems to offer a piecemeal approach to freedom, a really long walk. This also makes it almost impossible to organize for change against or within the humongous machine that is the CCP. I want to know if Liu Xiaobo was able to reflect on the response of the party to the rise of citizen journalism. I ask because the state has quite a lot of resources at its disposal vis-a-vis netizen gaslighting and various other tactics.
Yeah. The citizen journalism, I don't know if that's what Joy is thinking of, but there was one kind of it that was very important to Liu Xiaobo's movement, and that was beginning in the late 1990s in Guangzhou first, where these semi-official newspapers came out, the Nanfang Zhoumo and the Nanfang Dushibao. And those spread, that model spread to other cities, where newspapers would come out calling themselves the evening version or the business version, whose titles are a little bit misleading because the business movement versions weren't really about business. They were just a lower profile way to be able to do good journalism. And a lot of good young journalists got very much into that and made quite a contribution to spreading the stories of these unfairnesses that lights were being shined upon. I'm not sure I got that question well answered. Part of the first part of the question of shining a light on one case and hoping that that would permeate and be more significant, was that part of the thought of the first part of that question?
I think so. I mean, it was more a comment and just asking for your comment on the comment. But
Yeah,
yeah, the impossibility of organizing for change against the word used was machine, a machine like the Communist Party.
yeah,
You know, and the wealth of resources that the state has versus what individual citizens have.
yeah. Well, the key word there is organizing.
Right.
You can get a lot of popular opinion critical of officials, but if it gets organized, it gets smashed if they find out about it anyway. But that doesn't mean it goes away. It's still there. And if something were to come along like an economic turndown that made people angry nationwide, the underlying discontent would come out. And it wouldn't have to be super organized. And that's why, by the way, the parties spend so much money on stability maintenance. They know that that's the case, I'm afraid. They know that it's vulnerable, that their so-called legitimacy depends upon stimulating nationalism and getting people to think about that, and keeping the economy humming so that people still have the sense that our lives in general are getting better. But if we get to a point where that doesn't happen, there's this underlying discontent that can come out. Let me give another story that he tells to illustrate this individual case, but stimulating a broad underpinning of agreement. And that's the story of the rape of a young woman in Weng'an in 2008. Her body was found in the river, 17-year-old. She'd been raped, and there were 3 guys who did it, and it was more or less known who they were. But they were all well-placed young fellows from the leadership, so they weren't tried or they weren't even arrested. But somebody found this out and put it on the internet. And when it got on the internet, all around that Wuhan town, in neighboring towns, people were indignant, and they all came. Did I tell this story before today? No. They all came to Wuhan and they surrounded the local party office building and began to throw stones and overturn cars and burn cars. And finally, the People's Armed Police was called in to put it down forcibly. And Liu Xiaobo records all this. But then he asks this question: why did those other people from all around come to that one case? And this relates to your questioners or your comment here, your questioner's comment about how can one case be so important? In this case, it was very important. This was just one young woman who was killed, and then her uncle who went into the police station to object. He was also killed. So there were 2 victims. But tens of thousands of people came to protest. And Liu Xiaobo asks, why did tens of thousands come? Is it because they knew this family? No. It has to be because they have seen similar things and have suffered in similar ways. So when they see this thing coming out, they automatically take the side of the victim. And when the internet came, that kind of movement became possible. So there is underlying potential for discontent, yeah.
Okay.
And for movements, except they still have to be very careful about having a formal organization.
Okay. Thank you. Another question from an anonymous attendee who is asking about Liu Xiaobo's influence and legacy in China. There's actually a couple of questions from a couple of different anonymous attendees. I'll put them together for you here, but you can answer in 2 parts. This attendee recalls living and working in China when Liu won the Nobel Peace Prize and remembers a rather acrimonious reaction in the press and a rather muted reaction among my colleagues and friends. I was curious as to whether or not he remains known at all among a younger generation or if he has been essentially erased from history as part of a larger campaign to erase legacies of June 4th and other events associated with democracy. And do you hope your book will have influence in this regard? And then I'll tack on the second one. Is Liu Xiaobo's personal journey toward freedom in contradiction to or compatible with China's transformation?
Immediately for the second question, I'd want to ask transformation to what? What the party wants us to think of as transformation is a strong country, wealth and power, dominating inside and beginning to dominate, at least in Asia, and being a model for other authoritarianisms. If that is the progress, then what was the beginning of the question? What's Liu Xiaobo's contribution to it? He would be against that and not want that to be the transformation goal. A lot of his friends, though, and this is more true of ones that are already overseas than ones that are in China, have done a lot of talk about the problem of the transition, by which they mean the democratic transition. How can our country switch from what it's got to a democratic system? There's a lot of thinking about that and a lot of writing about that. So if that is what the goal of transformation is, then yes, he would be very much in favor of that. Now, I've completely forgotten the first question, which was what?
Is he well known at all among the younger generation, or has he been erased?
I think, sadly, largely erased. And that's one reason why we want to do this book and hope that it survives in more than one language, so that maybe 30 years from now, 50, people will be able to read what this was really all about. It can never be totally erased, let's face it. But erased from most young minds, I think so. Not only erased, but distorted. In 1988, November, when he was in Hong Kong on his way to Oslo, where he was going to spend a few months, he had an interview with a man named Jin Zhong, who was the editor of what was called the Liberation Monthly then. And in that interview, Jin Zhong, he observed that people in Hong Kong are pretty polite. They get in line to get on the bus. They get in line at the post office. Jin Zhong says, well, people in the mainland don't. How long is it going to take to get them to learn how to get in line? 100 years? And Liu Xiaobo made the sarcastic comment, it'd probably take 300 years. Okay, and that's in print, and he did say that. But that quote was taken by the propagandists in Beijing and spread very widely as the tag under which you will know Liu Xiaobo. 从这个东西可以认识他。And a lot of young people in China, including ones who are old enough and educated enough to know better, immediately associate Liu Xiaobo with that comment that we'd need 300 years of colonization in order to make China a civilized place. Which not only is out of context, it distorts his overall view of the West immensely. A few months later, he was in New York and he wrote a postscript to a book that he called Chinese Intellectuals and Chinese History, where he blamed intellectuals for not speaking out clearly. And this is why they don't measure up to brave intellectuals in the West who do. And then he wrote a postscript. And this postscript is another example of his willingness to criticize himself. The book's going to press, and he writes this postscript that undermines the thesis of the book. He says, it's wrong to hold up Chinese intellectuals against a yardstick of Western intellectuals. You can do that, but you can't do that if you don't also measure the Western intellectuals. And that goes for all of the West. My job now is twofold: to measure China as it measures against the rest of the world, and to independently evaluate the rest of the world. So that's really where he was intellectually. And this tag of he wants 300 years of colonization was very misleading. And another thing we write in the book about that quote is that he got it from Marx. In the second volume of the collected works of Marx that he read in high school when he was up in Inner Mongolia, he read two articles by Marx written in about 1853 about India. Marx was in India and was bemoaning certain Indian customs like the sati, where a widow, if the husband dies, is supposed to throw herself on the funeral pyre and be burned with her husband. And this is the, epitome of female virtue, horrifying to Westerners, including Marx and including the British who were coming to colonize. And he's got some paragraphs there, Marx does, where he says it becomes the burden of the imperialist power to change the mores of Asia, he says Asia, not India, so that we can all be more civilized. I think I can find the actual quotes here. I anticipated somebody might ask this. This is Marx speaking in 1853. The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? If not, whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. England has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating the annihilation of old Asiatic society, and then laying the material foundation of Western society in Asia. And there's other things in that Marx writing that Liu Xiaobo noticed, and he went to Hong Kong. He quoted a lot of the building of the railroads all over India to connect all of the little villages to the center, comes straight from an idea that he read in Marx. So that's where he got this idea. And what the officials in Beijing would do if they knew that, they'd probably just repress it, erase it. But it's much more complex than the tag that was put on him that misled a lot of young people in China about who he was and what he thought.
Okay, I think, I'm not sure if we have time for one more question or not, Jeremy.
I think we're almost out of time, so why don't we take that as Perry's closing statement, and I'll just say to everybody here, this book is going to come out, and it's going to blow your minds. It's going to blow your socks off. It's going to push you to think about yourself and what you want to do in the world, because that's what it did for me. And so I'm thinking about that first question about Liu Xiaobo's death. He did not want to go to prison. In fact, all those 8 points that Perry Link has told us about were meant to allow him to continue his activism and stay out of prison. But one of the Tiananmen mothers, Ding Ziling, mother of Jiang Jielian, who was shot and killed, he's a teenager, he was shot and killed on the night of June 3rd, she asked Liu Xiaobo to sign Charter 08 and to get out in front of it and be an organizer of it, and he couldn't say no. He had to say yes. He wanted to say no, but he had to say yes. He had to do it, and that's why he went to jail. At least that was the precipitating factor for his final imprisonment, and that's where he died in prison. And just the idea of nobody wants to go to jail. Nobody wants to go to prison and become a political prisoner. He realized that might happen, and he took that step to do that. And it was powerful for me to think about that. So I thank you, Perry, and Tsai Wei-ping for trying to bring that story to light. I thank Praneet from IT Services working behind the scenes for us tonight. I thank Jonathan Goodluckson for making this event possible. Lauren, thank you so much for handling the questions. And everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Perry Link for his contribution tonight. And we will say goodbye and good night to you. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here. We don't want you to go to jail, though, Jeremy. Inspired though you were by the book, stay out of jail.
Exactly. We'll all hope for that. Have a good night.
Have a good night.